In a quiet American factory, young women sat at long tables, painting the numbers on watch dials with a paint that glowed a soft, magical green in the dark. To make a fine point on their brushes, they were taught to slip the bristles between their lips and twist, lip, dip, paint, hundreds of times a day. They did not know that, with every touch of the brush to their tongues, they were swallowing one of the most dangerous substances on earth. And the men who employed them did know. This is the story of the women history would call the Radium Girls, and the poison they were told was perfectly safe. In the years around the First World War, a new element had captured the imagination of the world: radium. It glowed in the dark with an eerie, beautiful light, and people believed it was miraculous. Radium was sold as a wonder of the modern age. It was put into toothpaste, into face cream, into tonics and health drinks. People paid fortunes to drink water laced with it, convinced it would give them energy and youth. And it had one property that made it perfect for industry. Mixed into paint, it made anything glow, the hands and numbers of watches and clocks, so they could be read in the dark. As war spread and soldiers needed instruments they could see at night, the demand for glowing dials exploded, and factories opened to meet it, hiring hundreds of young women to do the delicate work. For those women, it was a dream job. The pay was excellent, far better than most work available to them, and there was a strange glamour to it. They worked with a substance that shone like nothing else on earth. They were mostly teenagers and women in their 20s, bright, hopeful, proud to be earning good money. They sat in rows, dipping their tiny brushes into the glowing paint and painting the numbers with careful precision. The paint dried invisibly on their hands, their clothes, their hair. When they walked home in the evening, they seemed to shimmer faintly in the dark. People in their towns began to call them the Ghost Girls. Some of them thought it was wonderful. They painted their nails with it for fun. They dabbed it on their teeth so their smiles would glow at parties. They even wore their best dresses to work so the dust would settle on them and make them shine. And all the while, the technique that made the work possible was slowly killing them. To keep their brushes sharp enough to paint tiny numbers, they were instructed to shape the tip with their mouths. Lip, dip, paint. With each pass, a trace of radium paint was left on their lips and swallowed. Over months and years, they ingested it again and again, thousands upon thousands of times. When one young woman asked whether the paint was dangerous, she was reassured. The material was harmless, she was told. Some managers even said it was good for you, that it would put roses in her cheeks. But radium is not harmless. Once inside the body, it behaves like calcium. And so the body, not knowing the difference, carries it to the one place calcium belongs. It buries it deep in the bones. There, it does not leave. It settles into the skeleton and stays, giving off its invisible radiation year after year, decade after decade, quietly destroying the living bone from the inside out. For a while, nothing seemed wrong. The women worked, laughed, married, planned their lives. The poison inside them was silent, and then, one by one, they began to fall ill. It often started in the mouth. A tooth would ache and have to be pulled, but the socket where it had been would not heal. Instead, it festered and refused to close. Then another tooth, and another. The jawbone itself began to break down, softening and crumbling, riddled with a decay that doctors had never seen and could not explain. The condition became so associated with the dial painters that it earned a grim name of its own. The doctors called it radium jaw. The women grew weak and anemic. Their bones became fragile, snapping under ordinary movements. Some developed tumors. Some simply wasted away in terrible pain, as their own skeletons betrayed them. They went to doctors and dentists who were baffled. No one connected the glowing paint to the illness. Some of the women were even misdiagnosed with other diseases, including conditions that carried deep social shame. And here is where the story turns from tragedy to something far darker. Because the company at the heart of it was not as ignorant as the women were. The executives and the scientists who handled radium in the laboratories protected themselves. They used lead shields. They handled the material with tongs. They wore protective aprons. They knew from their own research and from cases in their own industry that radium taken into the body was dangerous. They understood the risk far better than the young women dipping brushes between their lips. And yet the women were never warned. They were never given protection. They were told again and again that the paint was safe enough to swallow. As the dial painters began to sicken and die, the company did not rush to their aid. Instead, it moved to protect itself, its reputation, and its profits. When investigators began asking questions, the company disputed the findings. It funded studies designed to reach convenient conclusions. It suggested the women were ill for other reasons entirely. In at least one case, a company doctor examined the sick women, learned the truth of what was happening to them, and the women were not told. The knowledge was kept from the very people dying of it. The women were dismissed, delayed, and doubted. Some were too sick to work and lost their income just as their medical bills mounted. They were dying and they were being told, in effect, that it was not the company's fault. But among the dial painters was a woman named Grace Fryer, a former bank clerk, sharp and determined, who had begun to lose her teeth and feel her spine collapsing. Grace refused to accept silence. She became convinced that the paint had done this to her and to her friends, and she decided to do something almost no ordinary worker had ever succeeded in doing. She decided to fight. It took her 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take the case. The company was powerful, the science was new and disputed, and the law of the time barely recognized that a worker could sue an employer for making them sick. Eventually, Grace and 4 other dying women joined together to bring their case. The newspapers, seizing on the horror of it, gave them a name that would echo through history: the Radium Girls. By the time the case came to a head, the women were desperately ill. Some could barely walk, some could not raise their arms to take an oath in court. Their bodies were failing even as they fought. The public was gripped and appalled. Here were young women, glowing quite literally with the poison that was killing them, facing a wealthy corporation that insisted it had done nothing wrong. The company's strategy was cruel but effective: delay. Their lawyers understood a simple, terrible arithmetic: that if the case dragged on long enough, the plaintiffs would die before it could ever be resolved. And the women knew it too. They were racing not just for justice, but against the poison in their own bones, hoping to reach a verdict before it reached the end of them. Their courage in those months, sick and in pain and facing down a corporation, captured the conscience of a nation. Ordinary people were horrified that this could be allowed to happen. Under mounting public pressure, the case finally moved toward a settlement. The surviving Radium Girls were awarded compensation, money for their suffering and payment for their medical care for whatever time they had left. For most of them, that time was cruelly short. The radium was already deep in their bones, and no verdict could undo what it had done. Many of them died not long after their fight was won. But their fight did not die with them. What the Radium Girls achieved reached far beyond their own broken bodies. They had done something that changed the world of work forever. Their case helped establish, for the first time in a clear and public way, that a company could be held responsible for the health of the people it employed, that a worker's life was worth more than a factory's convenience. In the years that followed, their story drove new safety standards, new regulations, and a new understanding that industry could not simply use up human beings and discard them. The tragedy also transformed science itself. Studying the ruined bodies of the dial painters taught doctors how radiation moves through the body, knowledge that would later protect countless others in the atomic age. There is even a haunting final detail. The radium the women swallowed is so persistent that their remains are still faintly radioactive to this day, and will remain so for over 1,000 years. Decades after their deaths, their bones still whisper with the same faint radiation that once glowed on their brushes, a permanent record of what was done to them. They had been young women who wanted nothing more than good, honest work and a little glamour in a hard world. They were told the glow was a gift. It was a slow, invisible sentence. And they were failed not by accident, but by choice. By men who knew the danger and decided that the profit was worth more than the warning. But in their refusal to stay silent, in Grace Fryer's stubborn 2-year search for a single lawyer, those dying women left behind something powerful. They forced the world to admit that the people who make our comforts are not disposable. The Radium Girls glowed in the dark, and the world called it beautiful. Only later did it understand that the light was the poison, and that the brightest thing about them was never the paint. It was their refusal to go quietly.